Bé, bona tarda. És per mi un plaer, com a ponent de filosofia, tornar a presentar un convidat de les prestigioses lliçons Ferrater Mora, que organitza la càtedra Ferrater Mora de Pensament Contemporani de Girona. Agraeixo a la càtedra la seva col·laboració per fer possible aquest acte, especialment al seu director, el doctor Joan Vergés. Si el passat mes de juliol vam portar el reconegut sociòleg brasiler Boaventura de Sousa Santos, pensador del colonialisme i les alternatives polítiques, avui tenim nosaltres un dels grans noms de la filosofia política actual, el professor Allen Buchanan. Buchanan és professor de dret emèrit de la James B. Duke de filosofia a la Duke University i professor de filosofia del Dret Internacional a la Dickson Poon School of Law, al Kings College de London. Actualment imparteix docència a la Universitat d'Arizona. La seva àmplia trajectòria en filosofia moral i política l'ha portat a escriure principalment sobre qüestions de bioètica i de justícia internacional, especialment sobre el problema de l'autodeterminació nacional. És fellow del Hastings Center, una de les institucions de recerca bioètica més importants del món, i fins l'any 2000 va ser membre del Consell Assessor del National Human Genome Research Institute. Buchanan és un dels teòrics sobre els processos de secessió més reconeguts internacionalment des que va publicar Secession, The Morality of Political Divorce, l'any 1991, text pioner sobre la qüestió. També és autor del Self-Determination and Secession de l'any 2003, on amplia els seus punts de vista després dels casos de Lituània i el Quebec, entre d'altres. Com tots vostès sabran, el plet sobre la secessió de Catalunya, el referèndum de l'octubre i la celebració del referèndum escocès han fet que aquest debat sobre l'autodeterminació de les nacions torni a aflorar. Qüestions de com s'ha de resoldre una crisi d'autodeterminació, quins factors intervenen, si és possible trobar una solució pactada entre aquests litigis tan complexos, són preguntes que avui són de més actualitat que mai. Esperem que el professor Buchanan aquesta tarda ens esclareixi una mica aquests dubtes. So, Professor Buchanan, thank you for accepting our invitation and when you want.
Thank you. I'm very pleased to be here. I'm a little apprehensive because I'm talking about a very impassioned topic. I know there are a lot of divisions in society about this issue, and I'm aware that as an outsider, there are probably some facts I don't know that I should know. I'm not going to try to make a recommendation, or if I do, it'll be a conditional recommendation. Instead, I'm trying to provide a kind of framework for thinking about the independence issue, which I think may be helpful. Originally, the title that I had planned for this session was a little more negative. It was How Not to Manage a Self-Determination Crisis. But I decided that was a little too negative. I should take a more positive, optimistic approach. But as you'll see from this presentation, even with its more positive title, I think there have been some mistakes made on both sides. First of all, just some simple distinctions, probably familiar to most of you. We can distinguish between a unilateral right to secede, that is, a right to secede and become independent without the consent of the state, versus a consensual right to secede, a right to secede conditional on consent of the state or by some constitutional process. For example, the Supreme Court of Canada envisioned the possibility of the province of Quebec seceding and becoming independent from Canada through a constitutional amendment process. And in the case of Norway seceding from Sweden in 1905, it was done through a perfectly peaceful, consensual process. Now, there are two types of consensual secession. There's two-party agreement only, the two parties being the state and the seceding region. And then there's also the possibility of a third-party brokered agreement where some third entity helps to facilitate the political divorce. And this actually happened in the case of Norway and Sweden. Some of the great powers in Europe exerted some diplomatic pressure on Sweden to allow the Norwegians to become independent peacefully. Now, here's a list of what many people, and myself included, think are good justifications for trying to exercise a unilateral right to secede, that is, for going ahead and trying to become independent even if the state doesn't consent. Unjust annexation of seceding territory, and I put in parentheses recent because I think that there's a real problem about thinking that any group that at any time in the past, no matter how remote, suffered an unjust annexation of its territory currently has a right to secede. I mean, the question is how far back do you go? Just about every state, especially every large state in Europe, was the product of aggressive war and unjust annexation at some point earlier in history. So I'm a little skeptical about resting the case for Catalan independence on the fact that in 1714 it was annexed. A much more compelling kind of justification for exercising a unilateral right to secede is persistent violations of basic human rights. I don't think that, at this point, that applies to the case of Catalonia. Another good justification for unilateral independence would be state failure. If you're in a state where there's anarchy, where order is not being preserved, where there's great physical insecurity, and you think that you can establish law and order and peace and security in your region of the state by becoming an independent state, I think that's a perfectly legitimate justification. The fourth item is much more complicated, the idea of persistent discriminatory redistribution. That is, it can be a good justification for unilaterally seceding if the state is engaging in a serious injustice with regard to how it redistributes funds within the state. If it's simply exploiting one region and taking its resources and not giving back appropriate resources, then that could, if that persists and if the government refuses to renegotiate the redistribution scheme, that could become a good reason for seceding. There was an old Basque protest song, and it had a line in it which I've seen translated, and it said, "The mouth of the cow is in the Basque country, but the udder is elsewhere." So the idea was that the state was gobbling up the resources, but nothing was coming back. I just want to say that to try to make the case for independence on this fourth ground, you have to do more than say that there's a net revenue flow out of your region into the state. Wherever you have a welfare state, there's going to be some redistribution. And sometimes the redistribution will be correlated with regional differences because some regions are richer than others. So if it's true that Catalonia is not getting back as much as it's putting in, that by itself doesn't show that there's an injustice. You have to have some understanding of what would be a fair or a just redistribution. And then you have to show that that's not what's being done in this case. The next item is persistent violations of group rights. Now, this is a very tricky notion because someone might say, well, yes, there's a violation of one very important group right, the right of self-determination. But of course, that just begs the question, because the real issue is not whether Catalonia has a right of self-determination. I think it clearly does. The question is whether at this time that right of self-determination includes the right to full independence and to achieve full independence unilaterally without consent or constitutional process. Sorry, closer, excuse me. Sorry if you couldn't hear me. So I think that when you think about group rights in this context, if you want this to be a separate just cause for unilateral secession, then you'd be thinking in terms of language rights, for example. I do want to talk about the right of self-determination, which is a group right, but I don't think we should start out the discussion by assuming that Catalonia has a right of self-determination that includes the right to secede. That's what we're trying to figure out, so we can't just assume it. I think another good reason for unilateral secession, a condition that could generate a unilateral right to secede, is if the state violates an autonomy agreement. I also think that if the state persistently refuses to negotiate in good faith valid demands for autonomy, for renegotiating the autonomy arrangement, I think that can also become a condition that generates a unilateral right to secede. And clearly, it seems to me that these are the two conditions that are most relevant to the case of Catalonia. Now, here's what I think are not good reasons. These are not good justifications for a unilateral right to secede, and some of you may be very upset with me for saying this. There is something which people sometimes call the Nationalist Principle. It's a very broad general principle that says that every nation, or sometimes people say every distinct culture, is entitled to its own state. I don't find this plausible. I think it is plausible to say that every nation, depending on how you define what a nation is, and that's quite disputed, I think it can make sense to say that every nation has a right of self-determination, where this means that it is entitled to some degree of self-government, some degree of autonomy, but I'm not convinced that every nation as such is entitled to independent statehood. And one of the reasons I'm not convinced is that I think that national identity can be realized and legitimate interest of a nation can be realized in most cases within the context of some autonomy arrangement, that complete independence is not usually required. And I also think that it's a fiction when we use the term nation-state. We use the term nation-state a lot, and that suggests that there's one nation per state in the world. But in fact, there are almost no states that are mono-national. Most states include a number of distinct groups which could qualify as being called nations. And I think that if you had this nationalist principle and it were generally accepted and acted on, it would be a recipe for tremendous instability, because I think that most states would resist the idea of every nation within them having its own independent state. So I'm not an enthusiast for the nationalist principle. There's another principle which is also very simple, and that's the plebiscitary principle, that whenever the majority in a portion of the territory of a state prefers independence, there's a unilateral right to secede. And notice that that doesn't even say it has to be a nation. It's just whatever the majority is, whoever they are. If they're in a region that's distinct in some way, perhaps there's some administrative boundary around the region in the federal system, and if the majority of the people just happen to decide they want to have their own state, then they're entitled to do that. Again, I don't think this is a very plausible principle in terms of constitutional design, and I don't see why the fact that a certain group happens to be a majority in a portion of the state should allow them unilaterally to make a change that affects everyone in the state, and that will in effect create a new minority in the independent entity, namely the people who wanted to stay in the old state. Now, that's not to say that I don't think that referendums are relevant for independence. I'm going to say something later. I think that having a referendum can be a relevant element of a process of moving toward independence. But I don't think that it's as simple a matter as this principle suggests. And here's a principle that I already implicitly criticized, the simple redistribution principle. Any net revenue flow out of one portion of the state is unjust and gives that portion a unilateral right to secede. I was sitting at a cafe in Girona day before yesterday, and I happened to be sitting next to a couple of German tourists, and they were from the richest part of Germany. They were from Stuttgart. And I asked them what they thought about Catalan independence, and they said, oh yeah, we understand that. You know, we Southern Germans, we make all the money, and then it gets spent by all these other people in Germany. You know, and there's more money coming out of Bavaria than there is going into Bavaria. So, you know, why shouldn't we secede? And I was just, well, wait, slow down. You know, it's a little quick. So I think these are not good reasons, and I'm just mentioning because I think it's a good idea to clear the table and get them away and try to develop a framework of thinking that takes a hard look at more plausible justifications for a unilateral right to secede. Now, this is a little more complicated, and I'm afraid it may sound a little professorial and pedantic, but if X lacks the right to secede, and even if the state has the right to resist X's decision to try to become independent, it doesn't follow that the state should exercise its right. I mean, sometimes I think we get a little too obsessed with the rights language, and when we do, we tend to overlook the fact that there are some cases in life where even if you have a right, it's not the best thing to exercise the right. Because there can be other considerations. There can be considerations of proportionality. That is, you have to think about what's the relationship between the benefits of exercising the right and the cost or the harms that might be done. And in some cases, a state might have a right to do something, but it wouldn't be the best course of action for it to exercise the right, especially if exercising the right required violence, required massive coercion. And at the end of my presentation, I'm going to make a plea to unionists, a plea to people who are against Catalan independence, and ask them to really think hard about why they believe it's so important to maintain the current territory of Spain and the current scope of the sovereignty of Spain. Now, again, this is not going to please a lot of people who are here probably, especially people wearing the little yellow ribbon. But I think there's a sense in which the idea of secession is a very conservative idea. That sounds paradoxical because it's a radical change of the constitutional status quo. But sometimes secessionist thinking betrays a kind of lack of imagination and a kind of statist bias. That is, we're having a problem with the state. Oh, let's get our own state. Well, sometimes the problem isn't with having a state or not having a state. It's with what kind of state you have. And I think sometimes people don't give enough scope to thinking about whether it may be possible to satisfy their needs through something short of full independence, some more robust form of autonomy. I also think from talking to some people here in Catalonia that sometimes they're a little over-optimistic about what will happen if they get their own state. I mean, look, if you get your own state, you'll still have incompetent, corrupt politicians, just like everybody else in every other state in the world. You'll still have some really complicated problems. So independence is not a magic wand which is going to transport you into a utopia. And I think there's a tendency when you really want independence, and maybe you want it for good reasons, to exaggerate the benefits and underestimate the costs. I think that's a natural tendency. And I think it's often true that many times people start out wanting greater autonomy, and then they become secessionist because the government is rigid and doesn't allow them greater autonomy. In fact, well, this may sound extreme. There are times when I think that there's someone deep in the government in Madrid who is an ardent Catalan independentist, and he's advising the government to do things which are converting autonomist into secessionist. Whether they're doing it deliberately or not, it seems to me that's what the Spanish government is doing. Now, I've said that I think that it's worth considering whether greater autonomy is a better strategy than going for full independence, but I don't want to be naive about this. I think there are some obstacles to getting a new and better autonomy agreement. And the main problem here in Catalonia, as with other cases where there's a region that wants greater autonomy, is that there's what I call a double-sided assurance problem. That is, the people in the region might, maybe it's too late now, but maybe at some earlier point, they would have settled for autonomy if they could trust the state to honor an autonomy agreement. But they don't feel that they can trust the state because they know that the state can unilaterally revoke the autonomy agreement. Either the executive could revoke it or the Supreme Court might nullify it. So that makes it harder for people who might really be satisfied with autonomy to try to be willing to stop short of independence and try to negotiate autonomy, because they just think that they're in an asymmetrical situation with respect to power, and they don't feel they can trust the state to stick to an autonomy agreement if they're able to get the state to make the agreement. But there's also an assurance problem on the other side, on the side of the state. States worry that if they grant greater autonomy to a region, that one of two things may happen. Either other regions may also demand more autonomy, or even if the other regions don't, the state that they granted autonomy to may say, oh yeah, that's fine now, but now we want more, and we want more, and we want more. And so that there's a sort of a slippery slope toward demands for full independence. And if the state doesn't have some assurance that that's not going to happen, the state may be reluctant to engage in good faith in renegotiations about autonomy arrangements. So there's a trust problem, there's a credibility problem, an assurance problem on both sides. Now, is there any way to try to solve this double-sided assurance problem? I don't know. The only prospect for solving it that I can think of in circumstances where there's already been a loss of trust on both sides, which I think is understating the condition here, is if there's some sort of third-party involvement in the process of trying to reach an autonomy agreement. And what would the third party have to do to try to at least reduce this assurance problem? Well, it would have to help broker the agreement. It would have to sort of mediate and help the parties communicate with each other. And then if an agreement were made, the third party would monitor compliance with the agreement by both sides. Now, it wouldn't have any sovereign power to punish one side or the other if it violated the agreement, but if it was a prestigious third party that mattered in terms of world opinion, a respected body, then if it made a judgment that one side was flagrantly not complying with its obligations under the autonomy agreement, that could change things. The prospect of that might deter one party or the other from violating the agreement, and it might lead both parties to have more confidence that the agreement would stick. Of course, it might not be enough just for this third party to declare that there'd been a violation of the agreement on one side. It would have to be able to exert some kind of effective pressure if its presence was going to be a deterrent to violation of the agreement. It would somehow have to attach some kind of cost to the failure of one party to comply. Now, what about the Catalan case? I don't know if you can read this, it might be too small. I'm sort of summarizing. I think that there are inadequate justifications for unilateral secession, namely the Nationalist Principle, the unjust annexation principle. You may disagree with me. You might think that 1714 was just yesterday, and that it's arbitrary for me to say that by itself, the fact that there was an unjust annexation then is not sufficient. I don't think the simple redistribution principle works either. I don't think the simple plebiscitary principle works. I don't think a one-off simple majority referendum is sufficient by itself to achieve something as fundamental as secession, as fundamental a constitutional change as secession or independence is. And I'm going to say a little more in a few moments about what else I think would be needed. I think a referendum can play an important role, but I don't think it's sufficient by itself. Here's what I think is the best argument, the strongest argument for saying that Catalonia has a unilateral right to secede from Spain, a right to secede without the consent of the Spanish state. You'd have to make this kind of argument. Make the case that Spain has persisted, at least until this recent statement by Sanchez, in refusing to renegotiate Catalan autonomy. And again, I think that even if the government, Spanish government now says, yes, we're willing to talk about autonomy again, I think that it would be reasonable to require, as an act of good faith, that before such negotiations begin, the people will be released from prison and the charges of sedition and treason be dropped. I think that was an extreme overreaction on the part of the Spanish government. I think the smart thing for the Spanish government would have been for the October referendum a year ago was to say, it has no legal effect. Just don't do anything. I think they overreacted in a way that was damaging to themselves and made everything more difficult in terms of a peaceful solution. And then, of course, you can argue that, in fact, Spain has reneged on previous autonomy agreements, in particular in 2006 with the Supreme Court ruling that nullified some aspects of the existing autonomy agreement. And you could argue that unless Spain decriminalizes the referendum, revokes its charges against the independence leaders, it simply can't be trusted to renew autonomy discussions in good faith. So if I were in favor of independence for Catalonia, that's the way I would argue. Now, there's a third argument that's a little more subtle, and I'm not sure what to make of it because I don't know enough about the facts on the ground to know whether this argument applies. But it goes like this. Suppose you think that Spain has been mismanaging the economy so badly that its fiscal arrangements have deprived Catalan government officials of the resources they need to deliver the services to their citizens that they are required to deliver under the constitutional arrangement, right? I mean, there's a subsidiary principle. There's an idea that the regional governments are supposed to do certain things for their citizens and the federal government is supposed to do other jobs. Well, if the central government is performing in a way that undercuts the ability of the regional authorities to do effectively the jobs that they're required to do, right, then if that condition persists and the government shows no willingness to correct the situation, that could become a just cause for independence if independence was the last resort for changing the situation so that it was now possible to deliver the kinds of services that the people of the region are entitled to and that they deserve. I'm not sure whether this applies in the case of Catalonia. Some people would say it would, some would say that it wouldn't, but I think it's worth thinking about. Now, I'd like to convince people that unilateral secession should be a last resort because historically unilateral secessions have not been very nice affairs. They've, in most cases, resulted in violence. And the case of Norway is a real exception. It's not the rule. So I don't think one should lightly attempt independence unless one has tried other alternatives that are less risky and less liable to degenerate into some kind of violent conflict. So I think there's a duty to seek autonomy first. But of course, the question is, what do you have to do to realize that duty, to discharge that duty? How far do you have to go? How many times do you have to try to renegotiate autonomy? And if you keep running up against a brick wall, at what point do you say, yes, that's over. I've fulfilled my duty to seek autonomy, and now I have to do something else? I don't know the answer to that question, but I do think that it's better, if you're going to make a mistake in the direction of trying too hard or trying one more time than to risk making a mistake of not trying and giving up prematurely and then turning to a more radical solution. So here's a proposal. What about a new referendum that included not just the usual referendum question of, do you want independence, sovereignty, but would you prefer a new autonomy arrangement brokered and monitored by a suitable, trusted third party? Now, you would also have an option of voting for full independence. But I think if that's the option, if that option is on a referendum ballot, I think it's very important to include on the ballot a statement that would provide assurance to the new minority that would be created if Catalonia becomes independent. I mean, look, you've got to remember this, okay? You think of independence as a matter of a minority asserting itself against the majority in their state and getting their own state. But if that succeeds, you create a new minority, namely the people who identify themselves first and foremost as Spanish, people who opposed the independence. And I think you have to respect them, and I think you have to provide some assurance to them. You have to provide assurance that they won't suffer discrimination because they opposed independence. You have to provide them assurance that they can continue to use Spanish as an official language. And I think you have to provide them assurance that if independence is achieved, that the sovereign Catalan government will make every effort to make it possible for them to have dual citizenship. I think that if that were done, the referendum would have much more force. It would get more public opinion on your side in the international community. But also, I think, and this is a reflection of my appraisal of the Brexit referendum, I think there's something to be said for having a two-stage process. That is, to have one referendum vote, and then to have a cooling off period, maybe of a year or 18 months, and another referendum vote. Because I think experience with past referenda, especially in Quebec, where every 10 years or so they have a referendum on Quebec secession, and it usually is like 51%, 50.5% in favor, something like that. When political scientists interview people in Quebec who have voted in favor of Quebec independence on a referendum, it becomes rapidly very clear that most of them had no idea what they were voting for. And I think many people who voted yes for Brexit really had no idea what was going to happen. All they saw was what they thought were going to be the benefits. They had no appreciation for the cost and difficulty of leaving the European Union. So I think that secession's a pretty momentous move. And I think that it deserves more careful deliberation than a simple one-off, simple majority referendum vote. Now, I'm not recommending any of this. My suggestion is of conditional form. That is, if the Catalan leadership decides to go for full independence, I think there are better ways and worse ways of trying to do it through using a referendum. And I'm suggesting that this would be a better way than the kind of simple one-off, simple majority referendum process that they tried to use last October. This is something I already said. I really think, if you look at what has happened in other secession movements recently, especially the secession of the components of the Yugoslav Federation, right? This ended in disaster. It ended in bloody, genocidal, ethno-national conflict. But it also was a case where when these regions that had been part of the federal state of Yugoslavia seceded, they typically did not provide any assurance against discrimination against the new minorities that were created by their breaking off. In fact, the Croatian Declaration of Independence, the first line of the Croatian Declaration of Independence said, Croatia is a state for the Croatian people. Well, if you were a Serb, right, and that was about 30% of the population, and you read that Declaration of Independence, you know what's going to happen to you. You're not a citizen in your own state anymore because it's just viewed as a state for the Croatian people. That's exactly the thing you want to avoid. If you succeed in becoming independent, you will create a new minority. And you have to be sensitive to the fact that there are going to be some people who are going to wake up and realize that they're no longer Spanish citizens and that this is not going to make them happy. And that they're going to worry that because they were on the wrong side, the losing side in the struggle, that in one way or another they're going to be penalized. Whoops. Okay. Now, if Spain refused to recognize the legitimacy of such a referendum, the kind of complicated one that I've talked about, then I think Catalonia would have an even stronger case for exercising a unilateral right to secede. And I think it's likely that international approval of Catalan secession would increase if the attempt to become independent were done in this way that I suggested, through a more deliberate kind of two-stage process, the referendum, and especially a process that provided credible guarantees of the protection of the rights of the new minority. I think if all of that were done, especially if there were one last attempt to renegotiate autonomy before any such referendum, then Spain would have shown itself to be unreasonably inflexible. Now, suppose that it looks like an attempt at unilateral secession is imminent. It looks like it's going to happen. Spain should follow the lead of the UK and Canada. It should work for a lawful constitutional process of secession that reflects liberal democratic values. Spain and the Catalan secessionists should be prepared to enable a role for a third-party mediator on contentious points. And there will be contentious points. If the process moves forward, even if it's consensual, there'll be disputes about the division of the national debt. There'll be disputes about who gets various cultural treasures. It's not an easy thing. There are lots of ways that even what starts out as a consensual secession process can go off the rails and can degenerate into a non-consensual and possibly violent process. Now, you know, there's the predictable response from Spain. If we grant Catalonia more autonomy, other regions want as well. Well, my reply is, yeah, so be it. I mean, look, that might happen, but I think a democratic country should be willing to engage in deliberations that may result in further decentralization from the status quo, if there's sufficient popular support for decentralization. The Spanish government, or at least the Constitutional Court, Supreme Court, seems to fetishize the unity of the state. I mean, there's this kind of phrase that comes up, and I think that's a sort of a failure from the standpoint of political theory to realize that sovereignty is a bundle of powers and rights and responsibilities, and that sovereignty can be unbundled in various ways. There are many different forms of federalism. There are more robust forms of federalism and weaker forms of federalism. There are symmetrical federalisms and asymmetrical federalisms. Canada has an asymmetrical federal system where the province of Quebec has much more robust powers of autonomy or self-government than other provinces do. That's a possibility. We have to use our imaginations. I think there's a kind of dogma of centralization, even though I guess technically Spain is either a federation or a quasi-federation. I think there's still a lot of thinking that's somewhat rigidly centralizing. And you have to realize that centralized states, the fact that they were for a long time predominant and maybe still are, this is just a historical contingency, right? I mean, large centralized states were an adaptation, a response to a set of historical conditions. There was the need for security, so states needed to have large territories over which they exerted a lot of control in order to have big enough populations and enough resources to have armies that could provide security in the face of aggressive war by other countries. And they needed to have a large territory to have a large market. Okay? But neither of those are very good reasons anymore in most parts of the world. You can have large markets without having large states, right? I mean, that's what the European Union is about, in a way. And if there are reasonable arrangements for security, and if they extend even to smaller states, then it's not a good argument to say we have to have a big state and it has to be a centralized state for security reasons. Now, I've talked about the possible role for third party, and that may sound very idealistic and utopian, and it may be. Well, I don't think it's likely that the EU is going to step forward for this. The EU has enough other problems right now, and it's in a weaker condition than it's been in a long time, and I don't think it's likely they're going to play this role unless things really go badly. I mean, if it degenerated into a civil war or something like that, they'd have to step in, right? But God forbid that should happen. We're not anywhere near that condition now, thankfully, and so I don't think it's likely that the EU is going to step in, not just because it has enough other problems to deal with, because the EU is an association of states, and for any state, the idea of breaking up states is a threatening idea. Their default position is against secession. I don't see any positive incentives. I don't see that it's in the interest of the European Union at this point to step in and play the mediator role. I don't think that's going to happen. So if there's going to be some kind of mediator, I think it's going to have to be some ad hoc blue ribbon committee of internationally respected people from other countries that don't have any direct interest in what happens in the Catalan situation. But the EU could play an important role behind the scenes. Now here's I mentioned this is my final plea, okay? This goes back to the idea that even if you think you have a right to do something, even if you're just convinced that you have a right to prevent Catalan independence, ask yourself whether you ought to exercise that right. And also, just, remember that there may be more important things in life than preserving the current territory of the state. I mean, after all, the current territory of the state of Spain is the product of a number of historical accidents and unjust wars and all sorts of contingencies. It's not that that's the natural size and shape of Spain. There is no such thing. These are human creations, and I know it's natural for some people to say, no, we've got to keep Spain intact. We've got to keep the full scope of Spanish sovereignty. This was what people said in the United States at the time of the American Civil War. There were people who just said, we've got to preserve the Union no matter what. And we have to resist the Southern secession no matter how much blood it takes. I don't think that was a good argument. I think the better argument was, we have to resist the Southern secession because they're seceding to preserve and extend slavery. Okay? Preserving a state as such, I don't think, is a high moral priority. Not if the price of doing it is too high. So that's the plea that I end with. It's if you're against the independence movement, do some soul searching. Think about why you think it's so vitally important to preserve the current shape of Spain. And on the other hand, if you're an independence person, ask yourself whether getting an independent Catalonia, as opposed to Catalonia with greater autonomy, is really going to bring you into paradise. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Buchanan. Ara tenim encara una hora ben llarga. Si volen fer intervencions i iniciem un debat amb el públic.
Thank you, Professor. I must say I share all your points of view. I congratulate you. I'm so happy that someone agrees with me. But I would say, and here comes my but, that perhaps it's an oversimplification in the fact that there are, today I was putting more or less your arguments at the lunch, and I was told an argument that I want to put here is that in fact it's not a two-party struggle. Spain or Spanish government and Catalan government. There is a state against a state, and what they were saying is even if we try to be reasonable, there would be the other party, the popular party and the Ciudadans that would not agree, and because of the law that must pass the approval of the Congress, we will never get disapproved. So it's not a two-party, it's a three-party. And even I would say, on the other hand, in Catalonia, there is not a single party. There are people that some say they are forcing the struggle in order to do what works the best. So they are trying to confront in order, so there is not a two-party struggle, it's a four-party.
Well, I may not have been communicating clearly. I mean, when I meant two-party, I meant, you know, the region and the state. But you're absolutely right. You have a multi-party system, and different parties have different agendas, and different political leaders in different parties are using the self-determination crisis for purposes that have nothing to do with the merits of the case for self-determination. This always happens, right? I mean, and it's important to remember that. And it's important to remember that suppose you're a person who's in favor of independence for Catalonia. You're a citizen and you are in favor of independence. And then you hear a politician say, yes, I'm in favor of independence. Don't assume that they want the same thing you want or that they're sincere. They may be using you. They may be using the issue for purposes that have nothing to do with it, right? I think there's a tendency, if you're passionate about independence or if you're passionate about union, that when you hear a politician agree with you, you think they have the same values and that they have the same interest and agenda that you do. And this may not be the case. I think it's very important to be skeptical about that and to realize that these party factions with their leaders with their own agendas may cause problems at any point in the process as you move toward independence. I'm sorry, I couldn't.
Okay. Hi. Two short things. One is, correct me if I'm wrong, but you mentioned one of the points that could be a reason for secession, the fact that if the state doesn't provide, let's say, the economy, in economy terms, what we need to, let's say, support fundamental rights, let's say, I'm just saying it quickly.
Yep.
That could be a reason. Yep. So my question is, what happens if it's not only about economy? What happens if it's the law what doesn't allow us to guarantee some, what we consider, or what they are basic rights?
Yeah, well, I mean, if that happens, if the state is failing you, preventing you from enjoying your basic rights, then that's not quite the same as they're directly violating the rights, but I think it can still be
a justification. Now, things are a little more complicated than I said when I put up that slide where I said, you know, what about this third argument? What if you can make the case that the state is mismanaging the economy so much that it's depriving the regional authorities of the resources they need to do the jobs that they're supposed to do for their own people? Well, I think that there are many states that are incompetent in managing their economies, and that often that does interfere with the ability of the regional authorities to do the best job they could in serving their own people. But as long as you're still in the larger state, I think it's reasonable for the people in a region to consider not just their own interests and whether they're able to provide the services they need for themselves. But I think until the political divorce has occurred, they have some responsibility toward their fellow citizens in other regions, and that it might be appropriate for them to put up with a less than efficient government, even one that impairs to some extent their ability to provide services in their region, if the alternative is destroying the welfare state and greatly decreasing the well-being of their fellow citizens in other regions. And I think this is an especially important responsibility to think about if you're in a richer region and if your withdrawal from the state is going to make things much worse for other people. I mean, I think the welfare state is a wonderful accomplishment. They're often run badly and they're inefficient and they're not adequate in many ways, but I really think the idea of all people within a political jurisdiction working together to make sure that everyone has their basic rights and economic security, I think is a very important idea. And so when you consider the costs and benefits of becoming independent from Spain, one of the things you should think about is, well, if your reason for withdrawing is that you think the Spanish state's doing a bad job with the economy, well, what's it going to do? What's it going to be like without Catalonia? Now, who knows? I mean, maybe it would give them incentive to become more competent and more efficient if they couldn't count on redistribution from Catalonia to the state. That's one possibility. But I'm just saying that I think that even if the officials in a region have their primary responsibility to the citizens of that region, it doesn't mean they have no responsibility to others within the existing political order. Now everything will change if Catalonia becomes independent, but you're not independent right now. And so I think you do have to think about the impact of secession, not just on yourself, but on other people in Spain.
Yeah, hi. I've got two main criticisms. Hi, I'm there. Well, I think that you said on your last slide, you said that obviously the unity of a state is not something that is good per se, right? It's not something that should be taken for granted. So, but my view is like what I think that like you put an emphasis on preserving the state. Like you always what I get is that you are always placing the burden of the proof on those wanting independence. Mm-hmm. So they have to be sound, or they have to be they have to have sufficient reason to want to secede, right? And from my point of view, there is no reason why states should be prima facie be believed to, to have a right to preserve themselves just because, right? So, and on the other hand, also I think that because of that, your whole point is about whether there are sufficient reasons it's sound to be independent or not. But beside that, you also need to identify who is like the actor that's going to take that decision. So, and I haven't seen that. It's you beyond saying if someone has good reason for doing something, you have to know whether they are entitled to take that decision. So, and I think that's why nationalist theories are also important. So just to wrap this point, you also put a lot of emphasis on the state not having a right, like to say, okay, we don't want to negotiate any autonomy, but that I think that applies for self-determination as independence as well. I mean, like if the state has doesn't have a right to oppose decentralization just because, I think that's also applicable to to independence.
Look, I think you make a good point. I actually think, and this is what the Canadian Supreme Court ruling said, is that if you're in a liberal constitutional democracy, you cannot take the question of independence off the table. You cannot simply refuse to even consider the possibility that a national group within your country could secede. I think that's right. I don't just think that just any group that happens to be a majority in some region has a valid claim to be listened to by the state as for the possibility of independence. But I think it's certainly true that if there is a group that, for historical reasons, qualifies as a nation within the state, which I think Catalonia does, then I think that the state should be willing to discuss the possibility of independence. I don't think they're obligated to say yes just because it is a nation, but I think that you're right, that I think that the state, a democratic state, should be willing not just to allow negotiations about greater autonomy, but that it should be willing, in a case like this, with a genuine, I think, national entity, to be open to the possibility of a process that could end in complete independence. I think that's right. Now, here's one of the reasons why I think it makes sense, not just from the standpoint of the particular state, but of the international order, the whole association of states, to require some significant grievance, generally speaking, for someone to make a case for secession rather than just saying, well, why shouldn't people secede? What's this fetishism of preserving states? Why is the default position that you have to make the case to separate, right? This is your point. Why should you have to make the case? Well, I think that if you make secession too easy, you create problems. One of the problems is that you create the possibility that the threat of secession will be used as a strategic bargaining tool that will undermine constitutional democracy. There's a wonderful book called Exit, Voice, and Loyalty by Alberto Hirschman. And he says, if you're dissatisfied with whatever organization you're in, whether it's a state or a corporation or whatever, you got three alternatives. There's voice. You can try to protest your grievances and get them to listen to you and change. There's loyalty. You can just suck it up and continue to submit to an arrangement you find inadequate. Or there's exit, right? Well, secession is a kind of exit in a big way, right? You're not just leaving, but you're taking territory with you, okay? But one of the reasons that Abraham Lincoln was opposed to Southern secession was that he was worried that if secession became an accepted social practice and it was easy to secede, that this in effect would destroy democracy. Because whenever a group didn't like the results of a democratic decision, they could threaten to leave. Okay? And this would amount, if they had sufficient power, if the larger group wanted to keep them enough, this would amount to a veto over any kind of regular majoritarian decision-making process. So I think if you're thinking about designing individual states and designing a reasonably stable state system, right, an international association of states, you don't want to make exit too easy. There have got to be some hurdles to leaving. You can't just, say whenever somebody can compose a majority in some region of a state and get 50.05% of the vote, then they can leave. That creates really quite perverse incentives, I think. So it's not that I think that states as such are valuable, that I think that there should be a burden of argument on people who unilaterally want to secede. By the way, I'm all in favor of consensual secession through some law-governed process. I have no problem with that generally. It's not that I'm a unionist in the sense that I say, oh my God, what could be worse than a state breaking up? I don't feel that way at all. But I think that there ought to be some burden of justification on the part of people who want to break up a state, because the alternative of just saying, well, yeah, sure, you don't have to give a good reason. All you have to do is just say you want out. I don't think that's going to create the right kind of incentives, and I think it's going to really, in game theoretic terms, it's going to create a huge opportunity for strategic bargaining with the threat of secession in a way that can really undermine democracy.
Thank you very much. That was very interesting. You were talking about the prior duty to seek for further autonomy, and you were suggesting that in case of reasonable lack of mutual trust, that kind of situation seemed to call for third-party mediation. And I wanted to ask you about what if one of the parties, particularly the state that is the one in a position of force, refuses that mediation, whether you would consider that as a case of refusing to negotiate in good faith in a way that could ground.
I think that to just flatly refuse any significant role for a third party in negotiations about autonomy under the current conditions where there's a great deal of reason to be distrustful, I think that could count as refusing to negotiate secession. And if everything else has been tried, that could create a right to unilateral secession. Now, it still doesn't follow that you should exercise the right or you should exercise it now, right? There are all these other considerations about what's likely to happen if you exercise the right. But I think that, I think you raised a good one. What counts as the state refusing to negotiate is going to vary depending on the conditions. And if the only reasonable prospect for negotiation is third-party involvement, and the state flatly refuses any form of that, then I think that amounts to refusing to negotiate. So I think that could become, I mean, look, if the Catalan political leadership came up with a very plausible, credible third party that was willing to play a role in mediating negotiations about autonomy, and it looked like it was impartial and that it would really be beneficial to have that involvement, and the Spanish government just said, absolutely not, I think that would strengthen the case for unilateral secession.
Thanks, Professor. I enjoyed that very much. Before I ask my question, I'd just like to correct one thing. There's a misapprehension here that the UK government was being very democratic and being very accommodating to the Scots by allowing them to vote. David Cameron only allowed that because the percentage of Scots wanting independence was about 20%.
Yep.
And then now, after the first referendum lost, Theresa May refused outright for a second referendum.
Yep.
So using that,
no, I don't use that as a model. I don't use the Scottish referendum as a model for just the reason that you said, right? I mean, Cameron was very clever in a way, right? I mean, he predicted rightly that there wouldn't be a majority in favor, and so he thought there was nothing to lose. And in fact, by allowing the referendum, I think he decreased the motivation for independence, and it worked.
Yeah. But my question is that one thing I think I did, it's not mentioned explicitly, it may well be implicit, is I lived as a student here in the 1970s, and I kept a keen interest on things that were going on. And when I left here in 1978, I thought if the Spanish let the Catalans have their sardana and their language, well then they'll basically suck it up. See, most Europeans think that the repression, say, of the Catalan language ended in 1982. But in fact, since 1714, the freedom for the Catalan language has been the exception and not the rule. And even since 1972, the total immersion program was only put in because there was a strong socialist contingent within the Spanish Socialist Party, okay? And then when Aznar needed Catalan support, then they let Catalan alone. But as soon as the Partido Popular gets into a position of a majority government, the first thing they do is go against Catalan. And I think that you didn't seem to explicitly say that, okay? And I think that, for instance, with regard to Ireland, I think the real comparison is between Catalonia and Ireland. There was a conquest, there was destruction of institutions, and that continued for many, even centuries, okay? Yes. And I think that this is something which is underplayed and certainly is not understood in Europe. But the question of culture and the question of language and how that is played out in with regard to autonomy and demands for independence.
Good. Look, I think this is a really important intervention. Look, one of the just causes that I listed was violation of group rights, and language rights are very important group rights, okay, for a minority nation within a larger state. Now, I don't know enough. You obviously know the history better than I do. But I can see an argument of the form that you suggested, and that is it's not enough at any particular time to have a language right. What you need is security of language rights. Okay? That is, whether you have the language right shouldn't depend upon what the alignment of political forces is at a given time, which party is in power, right? It ought to be something that's entrenched, secure. Right? So it's one thing to have a right, it's another thing to have security in having the right. And I take it from what you're suggesting is that even when there have been gains in terms of language rights for Catalan, that they're insecure because whether those language rights are preserved depends upon shifting balances of political power. Now, if that's true, and if there's no other remedy for protecting, let's put it this way, for making those language rights secure, then I can see that as an argument in favor of independence. Now, I mean, again, this is all conditional. I'm saying if that's true, then I think something follows from it that's very important that you're pointing out. I'm not making the case that there's been a sufficiently serious violation of language rights to justify secession just by itself without any other kinds of considerations. But I think that it really is important for a minority group within a state not just to have the state at some point recognize that they have a group right of some kind, like a language right, but they need some assurance that that right is secure. And I don't know enough about whether it would be, well, it seems like it would be unlikely, but one possibility would be to make it a constitutional provision that this right be secure. But my understanding of the constitutional amendment process in Spain is that it would be very unlikely that you could get an entrenched constitutional right for proper preservation of Catalan language. And so that's a problem. That's a serious difficulty. I mean, there are other countries where belatedly group language rights have been recognized, like French in Canada, and in which they have become effectively entrenched and secure. But if that's not the case here, and if it doesn't look like it's going to become the case, you can't change things to make it that way, that's a serious consideration. I'm glad you brought this up.
Hi, just wanted to ask you over here, why you don't, because you say that you don't think that the simple fact that a nation, you say that you don't think a nation should automatically become a state. I was just wondering what the reasons are for you not thinking that the same applies to autonomy. In other words, why does the idea of nationhood warrant autonomy? Because it seems to me, maybe not so much today, but it seemed to me a couple of days ago at your talk in Girona that a lot of the considerations you were offering against nations becoming a state automatically may also apply to states obtaining autonomy. One of these considerations might be the idea that making nations coincide with states is an ugly form of partiality. I wonder whether these considerations may not also apply to nations obtaining autonomy within a state. And I should just, make a note of saying that I am a radical independentist who is, however, a little bit skeptical of nationalism, and I'm otherwise just interested in knowing whether there's a problem with the internal coherence of the argument. Thank you.
I think there are good forms of autonomy and bad forms of autonomy, and that autonomy is not a cure-all. But I think that in many cases, given that we live in a world with many very large states, that just in terms of some sort of principle of subsidiarity, that it makes a lot of sense to decentralize political power and to concentrate some political power at more local levels. That things just work better, that you come closer to having something like genuine democratic processes. I'm generally in favor of federal systems of some kind, and that's a system of autonomy for federal units. But yeah, I think that there have to be some limits on demands for autonomy. If that's what you're suggesting, I mean, you're suggesting that I've said, look, the nationalist principle, that every group that counts as a nation should have its own state, I've said that I think that's problematic. And you're saying, well, why doesn't the same apply to your claim that every nation has a valid claim to autonomy? Well, I think that in the case of national groups, depending on how you understand what a nation is, some people would say, like David Miller, for example, that it's part of the definition of a national group, that it's a group that has had some kind of self-governance or some stable aspiration for self-governance, and that it has sufficient political or cultural cohesion that it's a likely subject for being able to exercise some form of self-government in a reasonable way, a way that could produce good outcomes, that it's a reasonable unit for some kinds of democratic governance processes. But, having said that, I'm aware that there's a lot of dispute about what counts as a nation, or whether every entity that counts as a nation is a suitable candidate for having autonomy, or for having a particularly robust kind of autonomy. Those are all difficult questions. I don't have the answers to them.
Yes, good evening, Professor Buchanan. I have a little question that's been niggling me for some years now, a question that's been put by many friends. And it's the following. Correct me if I'm wrong, but in the Quebec and the Scottish referenda, only the people in those regions were allowed to vote.
Yes.
Now, I think, if I'm right, in the Article 2 of the 1978 Spanish Constitution, they say that Spain is an indivisible state. Therefore, if there were to be a binding referendum, all Spanish residents or people living in Spain should be allowed to vote. I really don't know what to think here.
Well, I think that if that's the interpretation of the Constitution, then it really makes a peaceful exit through referendum virtually impossible. I think, because from what I understand, the alignment of opinion in Spain as a whole is such that it would be extremely unlikely for the foreseeable future that a Spain-wide referendum would result in a yes vote. And I think it's true in Canada as well, that there are a lot of Canadians who live outside of Quebec who think that Quebec already has too much power and too much autonomy and too many special privileges, and they would not, well, some of them actually may be so fed up that they'd vote yes because they'd like to get rid of Quebec and quit having it make these special pleas for more privileges, but others would just say absolutely not. Generally, when people think about referenda being part of a process for a law-governed independence process, they assume that the voters are restricted to the region. And I think that makes sense, but there are further questions about whether you should require a supermajority, that is something more than just, 50%, little more than 50%. And there are also further questions about whether you should require a two-stage referendum. Those are all other questions that I think need to be discussed more than they have been. And also there's this thing that I keep harping on, and that is that the referendum process should be set up in such a way that it's made clear that if you're voting yes, you're voting for recognizing that you're creating a new minority, and that new minority should have rights, should be protected, and that there should be an attempt to facilitate dual citizenship if people want it. Some people may want that, okay? And that people will be able to continue to speak their language, their primary language as a recognized language. So yeah, I think you're right. If the scope of the referendum was, if the Constitution requires that, it really requires that. That's not just one possible interpretation, but it's the unambiguously correct interpretation. Then it looks like that's a huge obstacle. Then somebody might say, oh, you need a constitutional amendment to change that. But the same problem would arise at the level of trying to get a constitutional amendment to change that aspect of the Constitution, right? I mean, that seems like a dead end.
First, a simple question of clarification. I understood you as making the plea for more deliberative democracy in arguing that a more complex question should be allowed, that a two-stage process should be implemented, and so on and so forth. I think that's all very fine. What I didn't understand what exactly the nature of your strongest argument for a referendum or for a right to secession was. That went very quickly. Could you please clarify that a little bit? And then secondly...
Look, I agree with the Canadian Supreme Court ruling in the sense that I think that a genuinely democratic, liberal constitutional state should be willing to discuss matters of changing the shape of federalism, granting more autonomy to existing regions. And I think that in some cases it should even be open to the possibility of independence. Okay? I think they have a duty to consider, a duty to be open to this if it's done in if the proposal is to do it in a way that's consistent with democratic values and consistent with respect for individual and minority rights. And I think that in terms of what could trigger the existence of a unilateral right to secede, in addition to the obvious things like massive violations of human rights or recent unjust annexation, that there are other items on the list, and the other items that I think are most relevant to the Catalan case are violations of unilateral violations of existing autonomy agreements by the state, right, without some very good justification. I can't imagine what it would be. That's one thing that I think can be a just cause. And the other is simply refusal to enter into any reconsideration of autonomy arrangements. If the group in question has some reasonable claim to autonomy, and I think given the history of Catalonia, and I think that it does make sense to say the Catalans are a nation, I think there's a presumption that they're the kind of entity that's a suitable candidate for some kind of autonomy arrangement. So I don't think it's unreasonable for them to request autonomy, and I don't think it's unreasonable for them to express dissatisfaction with existing autonomy arrangements or with what they perceive to be the insecurity of autonomy arrangements. That is, the fact that even if an autonomy agreement is made, it can be nullified by the Supreme Court or unilaterally revoked by the executive, for that matter, right? I mean, again, it's one thing to have rights, it's another to have security of rights. And this applies to autonomy rights as well as individual rights or group rights, language rights, for example. Does that help at all? Is that?
What I was missing, and that was my second question, was what the point, where do you see the real basis, the foundation for the existence of group rights? Because that is what is underlying your whole argument, the very question or the very game that you are entertaining here. And one could, without having any real justification, I was lacking, you're a moral philosopher, I was missing the absence of a basic moral theory that justifies the existence of group rights here, because this is what is this issue.
Well, look.
And in the particular context in which we are, the group rights are usually, as you say yourself, group rights of particular nations that have to be recognized and so on. And this is a huge can of worms, right?
Look, you're preaching to the converted here in a way, right? I'm someone who generally has thought that talk about group rights is a lot more problematic than some people do, right? But I think that history matters, and that once group rights have been recognized, it makes a difference, and that simply unilaterally revoking or partially nullify them is very problematic and requires some very robust special justification. I don't see that in this case. And so there are two things. One is whether Catalonia should have had group rights recognized in the first place. What's the philosophical basis for that? Okay, that's one question. The other question is, if they've been recognized and expectations have been created, are those rights sufficiently secure? Are those expectations sufficiently protected? And what are the terms under which the group rights should be changed or revoked? And who should have the authority to do that in what way? Those are different questions. Now, I've written some about this, and look, I'm in an impossible situation here, right? Because I'm speaking to a public audience, and they're not all philosophers. Most of them are probably not philosophers, and I only have a certain amount of time. And yet, there's always going to be somebody in the group like you, who's very demanding about the philosophical basis of what I'm saying, and is so kind as to point out that I'm not giving an adequate philosophical basis for what I'm saying. And so I'm in kind of an impossible situation. But let me just say this. I think that in many cases, people have been too quick to claim that what's needed is group rights, when in fact a lot of the job that they want to be done could have been done by better realization of individual rights. That is, that sometimes what's really going on is that there's been a violation or lack of fulfillment of individual rights in a particular group, right? That they've been especially badly treated with respect to some individual rights. And then they may conclude that in the end, the best way to protect the individual rights of members of that group is to secure group rights, which will give them more political power to be able to defend their individual rights. And that's okay. I mean, if that's the only way you can do it, that's okay. But that's looking at group rights in a kind of instrumental way rather than looking at them as fundamental in the way that individual human rights are. I tend to look at it in that way. I mean, if you wanted to ask me sort of what's my somewhat deeper philosophical understanding of human rights and their relationship to group rights, that's what I would say. But there's a sense in which I don't think you have to resolve that issue here because path dependency matters. You already have had a recognition of some group rights, and it makes a certain amount of sense in the situation, given the history and given that it looks like this is something that this group qualifies a nation. And if that's happened, then I think there are, from that point on, there are moral constraints on what the government may do regarding those group rights. And that I think it's a very problematic situation if the government can make those group rights insecure, can revoke them through processes that are far from democratic and that don't give proper weight to the desires of the people whose group rights are being eroded. So it's a complicated story, but I mean, look, you know, you put your finger on an important thing. I mean, what I'm trying to do is to provide a framework that's accessible to people who think that group rights are important. I'm not going back to square one and saying you're overestimating the moral importance of group rights, or you don't have a secure enough basis for saying that Catalans have group rights. I'm not trying to fight that battle because I think that no one who's in favor of autonomy or independence would be persuaded. Instead, I'm sort of, I'm doing a balancing act. I'm trying to agree enough with some of the assumptions that are in place and then make some revisions and draw some different implications from those that make those assumptions usually make. But I'm not trying to go back to square one and say, you know, you're completely wrong. Catalonia is not a nation. There's, you know, a nation is an imagined community. It's a fiction. It's a work of propaganda. There really are no, morally speaking, there really are no group rights. At most, they're instrumentally valuable for securing individual rights. Maybe you should just go directly for individual. I mean, you could go that way, but I don't think that's going to make much headway in trying to improve the people's thinking about the current situation. I could be wrong about that, but you know, I'm trying to operate sort of at a middle level. Not at the deepest level, and not at a really superficial level. But that's just a strategic choice on my part, and it might be wrong. And it's obviously not going to satisfy everybody, right? I mean, you know, before I came here, you know, I didn't come to talk about Catalan secession. I came because I was generously invited to do a series of lectures. Oh, sorry. I was invited to do a series of lectures at Girona University, but I knew I was going to be asked to talk about this because I've done work on independence. I thought, well, how would I know if I did a reasonably good job or not if I talk about this stuff? And my decision was that if I dissatisfy people on both sides, I've probably done a good job. That if I fully satisfied anybody on one side or the other, I probably have done a bad job. So I think I'm doing a reasonably good job because I think I'm not making anybody happy completely. Oh, microphone. Oh. Sorry.
Hi, Alan. So I wonder whether you could speak to a tension between two of the requirements in the sort of ideal referendum process that you laid out. On the one hand, there was clarity. You pointed out rightly that in '95 in Quebec, not many people knew exactly what they were voting for. On the other hand, there is the idea that an adequate referendum process should be a tiered one in which there's a first question. There's then, if there's a yes vote, that triggers negotiations, in which negotiations can either succeed, in which case there'd be a second referendum perhaps on the agreement that is arrived at, or not succeed, in which case there is another referendum on secession. So first referendum, give the government a mandate to negotiate. There could be two outcomes to that, and then, depending on the outcome, another referendum. So that seems ideal. That's hard to package into a referendum question in a way that satisfies the clarity requirement, which, as a half-hearted defense of what happened in Quebec, that's what they tried to do with the '95 question. It got mocked a lot. But in fact, they were trying to say, look, do you agree not to secede? Do you agree to give these people the mandate to negotiate with the Canadian state? And if they don't succeed by such and such a date, to then trigger negotiations for secession. So it seems to me that the two-tieredness and the clarity requirement pull in different directions.
Well, I think that the fairly complicated two-tiered process that I sketched makes it much more difficult. I agree, it makes the clarity question much more difficult because you're really not just trying to provide a clear question on the first referendum matter as if that were the end of the story, but it's got to be a bridge. It's got to be connected to this other process, okay? And so, I'm glad you brought this up because I'm often kind of skeptical about my philosophical colleagues who are very big on democratic deliberation and seem to attribute powers of cognition and deliberation to ordinary people that most of us don't have. And so, I think that a lot more thinking needs to be done about how you relieve this tension. Maybe you can never completely eliminate it, but this just comes back to something that I've been talking to Joan Vergas about as my visit here has gone on, and I'll see what you think about this. I mean, I know you, I know your work. I think that analytic political philosophers, especially democratic theorists, haven't paid enough attention to referenda. That we need a theory of referenda about when referenda are appropriate, for what kinds of issues, and how they ought to be structured, and whether there should be supermajorities, and if so, why, and whether they should be multi-staged or not. I just heard today that there's a constitutional theorist who's written a book about referenda that I haven't read, that I'm going to read. But I think that, it would take a lot of work to flesh out this sketch of an idea that I floated. It's just that I'm very skeptical about one-shot simple majority referenda, especially on the basis of these confusions in the Quebec referenda, and also Brexit. It just seems to me like it's not taking it seriously enough. I mean, if you're doing something that amounts to a constitutional change, it's going to take a little better process. But again, there's always that trade-off, right, between the understandability of the procedure and the complexity of the procedure to try to hedge against the different risks. That's a really good point.
Bé, hauríem d'anar acabant. Si decidim les últimes preguntes, quines ara mateix quines queden? 1, 2, 3 i 4. Fem aquestes 4 i 5, però no tenim temps. Fem aquestes 5 i ja està. I si pot ser les preguntes breus i la resposta també.
Hello, Professor. It's really fast. I kind of agree that having a 50% burden in a referendum, so that the yes vote, for example, wins for 50%, can represent a problem. My first question is, do you think politically the result has to be applied if the burden has been 50 or 51, if it has to be applied? And the second question is, if what is being discussed is independence, why not having a binary question with independence yes or no, but including other options. And where does this including other options stop? Thanks.
Well, that's, this also comes back to your point, how complicated do you want to make the referendum question? People seem to have enough trouble with a simple binary choice, and so if you have autonomy as an option and complete sovereignty is an option, you've got to be able to explain the difference to people, right? And some people will have difficulty understanding it, and so maybe that means that you need a first referendum that's on the autonomy question. And you try to explain carefully that this is not full independence, and you see what happens with that. And then you have, depending on how that goes, then you have another referendum in which there's another option or a different option, complete independence. But again, all I'm trying to do is to just suggest that a somewhat more complicated referendum process than the one that was used a year ago is appropriate, and I'm offering some suggestions about how it might be made more appropriate. But I think there needs to be a lot of thinking about how to do this to be able to answer your question. I haven't done it yet.
Good evening. During your conference, you set a list of grievances which, when they take place, allow a people to exert its right to self-determination in a just or legitimate way. But I noticed there were two common features related to all those grievances, which is that they need to be grave or persistent, right? So the problem is that I think that grave or persistent are concepts which can only be assessed from a very subjective standpoint. That's the problem. I mean, going back to the language rights issue, yep. My view is that language rights in Catalonia are not fully recognized, because if you take a look at the Spanish legal system, there are structural language discriminations which are very serious, and as it has already been said, the ones which are recognized nowadays cannot be fully enforced, mainly because of because they are dependent on political shifts in Madrid, among other factors. So, but other people could argue that that's actually not the case, because their view is that current recognized language rights are more than enough. So my question here is, how do you set like a method to assess when, and I mean from an objective point of view, Yeah. How do you qualify that a grievance is, I don't know, persistent or grave enough in order for a people to exert its right to self-determination in a legitimate way? That's my point, because there needs to be an objective method, an objective system, right? Otherwise, I think there's a problem here. Thank you.
Look, I think this is an excellent comment. Look, there is no mechanical formula or algorithm, an objective formula that's going to tell you when the state has persisted long enough in some injustice that now there's a grievance that could be expressed through independence. There are also, you're quite right, I mean, if you talk about violations of group rights, there can be clear cases of very severe violations, right? And there can be perhaps some clear cases of genuinely respecting the group rights, but there are going to be gray areas in between. And there's no substitute for judgment in the end. And reasonable people may disagree about what, I mean, look, the reason that I add the persistence idea is that I think that it's part of the idea of a democratic society, the democratic ideal, that you recognize that government is imperfect, and you recognize that governments will make mistakes, and you recognize that sometimes you will lose and sometimes you will win. And so there's got to be a kind of commitment to attempting to work through problems, and a recognition that it may take some time to work through problems. Okay. But this is all conditional, right? I mean, it's not something that you don't have to continue the commitment to try to reform the system or make things better forever. if you come to a point where you think that you have good reason to believe that the other parties are not cooperating in the effort to achieve reform, that they're not taking seriously your complaint that your language rights are not fully realized or that they're insecure. Okay? There's no open-ended, unconditional commitment to trying to work things out through democratic processes. But I think there has to be a commitment to having a certain amount of patience and trying to use lawful democratic processes to achieve your goals. But the situation that you're in now, as far as I can tell, is that an outsider like myself might say, well, you know, you should try one more time. You should try one more autonomy agreement, or you should try one more time to get more respect for your language rights. That's easy for me to say because I haven't experienced the frustration that you've experienced. And in the end, you know, there's no objective formula for this. At some point, you've got to sort of weigh the costs and benefits and the risk that you'll take if you give up on the process of trying to reform the system and instead take the radical step of leaving the system, of exiting. That's just something you've got to decide for yourselves. But I think, you know, you need to decide it in the light of the best information you can get, not just about the benefits, but also the risks of taking that exit solution. But I think, you know, it's part of the idea of democracy that you should be willing to accept that you're not always going to win and that it may take time for you to get more justice. But that's not unlimited, you know. At a certain point, you just, you know, you just may conclude enough is enough, and you may conclude, especially because of the peculiar nature of the Spanish Constitution, that it's unlikely, and the culture of the judiciary, right, that what might be a peaceful path toward democratic reform in other countries is not likely to work here. That might be the case. You're in a better position to know than I am.
Hi, thank you very much. It's been a long discussion in here about what we call the I think it's called the universal right of the indigenous people, because in its translation to Spanish it doesn't say indigenous, so we take it as Alfred de Sayas said, as a right that growing up, it did grow up through the time. That right, it's signed by the Spanish. You know the case. So that's one. What do you think about if it compromise the Constitution, even it's unbreakable as a country, because it's an international right that Spain signed in '77, and Article 96 says that it's unbreakable, has treatment into the national law. That's the kind of thing. So just your point of view about that.
Well, if I understand, this is really interesting. It connects with your question about group rights, okay? Because there has been a development in thinking and in international law in the recognition of indigenous peoples' rights as including group rights, okay? And there's a lot of controversy about what the proper understanding of an indigenous people is, right? The sort of usual understanding is, you know, sort of brown people who were colonized, something like that, recently. And there's a certain arbitrariness to that, right? And the idea of being indigenous people has become a political instrument and an ideology that all these groups have a lot in common has grown up, and it's actually false in many cases, right? I mean, I don't think there's really a distinct natural kind of sort of indigenous people. There are lots of different kinds of people, and there are sort of, as it were, degrees of indigenous depending upon what point of history you look at for when a certain group took over and subordinated another kind of group. But my understanding of the Declaration of the Rights of Indigenous People as an instrument in international law is that it does not recognize a right to full independence for indigenous people. What it recognizes is a right to autonomy. Okay? So if you wanted to say that vis-a-vis the Castile-Aragon political entity, that Catalans are an indigenous people, they share some features of being dominated in the ways that, and marginalized in the ways that we think of indigenous people, and that generates a basis for group rights of some kind, including language rights, right? And rights of autonomy, then yeah, that's plausible. I think there are more direct routes to saying that they have rights to autonomy. But even if you could get people to accept the categorization of Catalans as indigenous people, it wouldn't follow that they have a right to secede under international law concerning the rights of indigenous people. Now it's interesting in the United States. I mean, the United States has a well-deserved bad reputation for how it's treated its indigenous people. But having said that, it's a fact that the recognized indigenous groups in the United States have a very high degree of sovereignty. They're called Indian nations, and they actually have pretty robust legal constitutional powers of sovereignty, much more robust than the federal units of the United States. In fact, in recognized Indian nations, and that's what they're called, they're actually exempt from having to comply with all of the entrenched rights in the Bill of Rights. For example, among the Pueblo Indians in New Mexico, the First Amendment to the United States Constitution, which requires separation of church and state, does not apply to them. To be a member of the tribal government, you have to be a member of the priesthood for their religion. So, I mean, you think of the United States as a federal system. Yeah, it's a federal system in that there's the state of North Carolina, this New York State, Utah, et cetera. But there's also embedded within that this kind of sovereignty, something approaching sovereignty for the indigenous people, although there's no secession movement, there's no independence movement among Native American peoples in the United States, because they think, first of all, it's unlikely to happen, but they actually don't think it would improve their situation. Because under federal law, they are entitled to support from the US government. And if they became independent, they would be so weak that I think they would be in worse shape even than they are now. And by the way, how well American Indian tribes are doing varies enormously. Some of them are doing very well, some are doing quite miserably. There's a tribe in Connecticut that has about 65 members, and they, like other Native American groups, are entitled to have a casino, and they have a casino, and all 65 members of the tribe are millionaires. Okay. And then there are other tribes like the Sioux on the Pine Ridge Reservation who are living in terrible poverty with terrible drug addiction problems, high unemployment, high crime rates. But the point is that there's a sense in which the U.S. has taken seriously the idea that their indigenous people have autonomy rights, rights of self-government. So that's a possibility.
Hi. First of all, about this last intervention, I agree that indigenous peoples have these inherent rights. Because I'm in the view of Kimlicka, that say all these things that about whether it's appropriate to give rights to minority peoples, and when not, and to me it's not a problem to make some laws or some recognition, to give recognition at these people if they respect some basic liberal values. And about the point of group rights and individual rights, this eternal fight, I think that it's not a big issue that group rights could be an imaginate thing, or an imaginate, I don't know, nations could be an imaginate thing, but it does not minorate the right to hold these rights, because they are intrinsically linked with the personal behaviors and personal wealth. Yeah, Joan Burgess says these things in one of these books. I'm sorry, who says it? Joan Burgess. Yeah. A lot better than me. And the question particularly is that I have the intuition that in this putting these things over the table, we have that there are states that tend to perpetuate themselves, thanks to inertia, and then there are some peoples that place some cards in the game, so yeah, they are agents if they are nations, but I think that we are not considering the thing that there is an essential level of power linked with the ethnic question. In all the states, I think that I think that in the more essential thing is that we are thinking in states that they are neutral and ethnically neutral, and this does not exist at all. Maybe it's Switzerland, but it's an issue. I think this is the core. Thank you very much. Sorry.
Look, I'm sure I didn't understand everything you said, and it's not your fault. It's because I'm exhausted and losing my concentration to some extent. I also don't have the best of hearing. But the last thing you said, if I understood you properly, you said you don't think there are really any examples, with the possible exception of Switzerland, of genuinely multi-ethnic or multinational states. Is that what that work? Was that what you were saying? Okay, so you're skeptical about the possibility of having some robust forms of federalism that would give a lot of autonomy to some ethnic or ethno-national group. You think that that kind of multicultural democracy is just something that rarely works. Is that the idea? Well, I guess it depends on whether you think Canada is working and whether you think the U.S. is working, because it does have these radically different ethno-national groups, indigenous people. I don't think the U.S. is working very well now, but I don't think that's the reason it's not working very well right now. I mean, that's just a really large question that's been debated a lot. I mean, what's the alternative? I mean, if you think that genuinely multinational or multi-ethnic national states don't work, that there's just no way to accommodate that kind of diversity in the population and encompass them in a single democratic union, then what's the alternative? Is it that you should break up all such states into homogeneous, ethnically, ethno-national homogeneous units? I think there are a lot of problems with this because these different groups tend to be mixed up with each other. They're not neatly, discretely found in particular regions. So you just carve the state up according to the boundaries of those regions, and then everybody has their ethnically or nationally homogeneous state. But I also think that there's something morally suspect about the idea that we shouldn't be able to live in the same political union with people of a different ethnicity. I think it's unduly pessimistic, and I think that it's very difficult to maintain a kind of notion of equal status or equal dignity of human beings, regardless of which group they're in, if you give so much weight to ethnic divisions that you think that you have to have completely independent political units for each ethnic group. I think it's a kind of capitulation to tribalism, to put it in a more dramatic way and make it absolutely clear where my biases lie. I think it's too early to say that multinational or multi-ethno-national countries don't work. I just think it's too early to give up on that. And I think that the alternatives to trying to continue that experiment are not very promising. They're very risky and can encourage some of the worst attitudes that human beings can have toward one another. Let me say one thing. Thank you very much for being very generous and kind and civil. It's hard sometimes to be that way when you're deeply engaged in a political matter like this. And I've been very impressed with the way I've been treated while I've been here, when I've been talking about a very difficult, controversial subject in which passions run high. And I can't tell you how grateful I am for your civility. And I don't know what would happen if I went to Madrid and gave this talk, but I'm not as confident that I would be treated as well. Maybe I would, but that really doesn't matter because I'm not about to be invited to Madrid. There's no way that's going to happen. So thank you.
Thank you, professor Buchanan. Moltes gràcies a tots per la seva assistència, pel nivell de les preguntes i ens veiem a la propera. Gràcies.